So we now have an opportunity to hear from our response panel, and I'm going to briefly introduce them. They're all fabulous, but I'll ask you to hold your applause until I've introduced them all, after which they'll all have a brief 3-minute opportunity to give a perspective on the question before us this morning, which is, what should BC's economy look like in 2013? After we've heard from the panelists, I'll ask Tamara to make a few additional comments, and then we'll move on to the Q&A. So our panelists, we're delighted to be joined today by Prem Gill. She is the Chief Executive Officer of Creative BC. It's a nonprofit society responsible for promoting the development of creative industries in British Columbia. She's also on the board of the National Screen Institute, and she's well known as a passionate and I think very effective advocate for building BC's reputation as a world-class centre for creative content production. Beside Prem is Taleeb Noormohamed. He is a tech entrepreneur, Chief Growth Officer at Farfetch, and he's formerly Vice President of Strategy and Partnerships at the Vancouver 2010 Olympics. He's also active as a community volunteer with organizations like Covenant House, the Lionsgate Hospital, the Kerner Foundation, and the Alan McEachran Institute of Public Policy. Ross Beatty is also with us today, and he is very well known to BC audiences as the founder of Pan American Silver and various other highly successful mining ventures. More recently, he's moved into the renewable energy space, creating Altera Energy, which is a leading global renewable energy corporation. He's also known for his work with the Nature Trust of BC and the BD Biodiversity Centre at UBC. And last but definitely not least, we have Iglika Ivanova. She's well known to this group as senior economist and public interest researcher with the BC office of the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And she investigates issues and trends in healthcare, education, social programs, and examines the impact of public services on quality of life. Please join me in a warm welcome for our panelists. So Prem, I'm going to start with you and ask you for your 3-minute perspective. I know that's tough, it's only 180 seconds, but on the question of what should BC's economy look like in 2030?
I was trying to do it in 140 characters, but I'll do that later. So thank you very much for inviting me here today. I think, I've been thinking a lot about this question, and we have an excellent foundation already when it comes to the creative industries here in British Columbia. In the last, I would say, 5 years, this sector has grown. We're an important contributor to the GDP and jobs as well. We're now a global leader in visual effects and animation, and that's all happening in British Columbia because we've had the climate to develop that. But it's always very fragile, these things. And one of the things that I think about a lot is the creation of intellectual property here in BC and storytelling. And the sectors we represent are motion picture, music and sound recording, book and magazine publishing, as well as digital and interactive media. So it's a broad perspective. But one thing we have in common is that these sectors both have two sides to them. There is a very strong service industry, which is fantastic and continues to grow. Everybody has probably been reading about the strength of British Columbia's film and television industry. The other side of this is always the investment into British Columbia storytelling, and that is, I believe, very critical in our growth. Because we live next door to the biggest English language content creator in the world, it will have a big impact on where we're investing. And I'm really happy to see that the federal government is actually looking at Canadian content and what does it mean in terms of the technologies that have changed, the Broadcasting Act. What do we mean by CanCon? Does it represent who we are? These are big questions, and it's very interesting. We're at that this conversation is happening across the country, but it's also happening globally. I think where we can continue to lead is just build on that foundation. And one of the things that we talk a lot about is also our cultural diversity and gender balance in the creative industries, and we still have opportunities to grow in that respect. And that is something that I think if we're going to position ourselves to really be leaders by 2030, that we have to foster an environment that really supports more integration of a variety of voices into the creative sectors.
Thank you very much. Moving on to Taleeb, your perspective, please.
Thanks very much, Anna. And I just actually should say, former Chief Growth Officer of Rockbridge.
Oh.
Very, very, very recent, but I'll be able to talk more about what I'm doing coming up very
We'll
shortly.
look forward to hearing about that.
I wanted to just take 30 seconds as a bit of a policy wonk myself to just frame the context around which I'm going to share my thoughts on tech and innovation and what we need to be doing. I just got back from Toronto, where I was at the 6 Degrees Summit, and there were two things that were being discussed in the notion of how do you encourage global citizenship and how do you encourage and enable everyone to participate in economic success. And really it came down to two things: the ability to create opportunity through empowerment and education. How do you educate people? How do you give people the skills that they need to be able to do well? How do you mediate the notion of empowerment versus charity, and how do you make sure you are creating environments where people can lift themselves up through the skills and the opportunities that you give them? And it comes back to my own view of the world, which comes through my own faith. The Islamic ethos talks about two things. One is the notion of empower people to lift themselves up, give them what they need so they can be successful rather than a handout. The other piece is that the notion of wealth creation is not necessarily a bad thing as long as that which is in excess is used to help others, to create opportunities for others. So that frames actually how I think about doing the work that I do in business. And so the message that I would sort of start with is that, the challenge for progressives as you think about tech, and you think about innovation, is that you have to, I think, be willing to be open to the idea of creating an environment where economic growth, wealth creation, and social good are not seen as oppositional. And I think often we get into this sort of polarized view of the world where we say, if you create wealth, this is a bad thing because you are somehow turning your back on social good. And I think we have to start thinking about how those two pieces work together. And when you think about the innovation economy and tech, I think this is where the two worlds can meet extremely well. I think that we have created for ourselves a perception of who we think we are in terms of the BC tech world. We think we are world-class. We think we have all of these things available to us. We think we are truly innovating. And in some places we are. But in many places we are not. And we're not innovating largely, ironically, not because we don't have good ideas, but because what is required to innovate is an environment that enables innovation. And what does that mean? What that means is that you have to think about the idea of, where does the capital come from? What does capital look like? Is it money? Is it talent? Is it resources? Is it education? Is it space from which to operate? And then you ask the question, what can government enable? What can government do to make those things come to life? The reality is this: the flow of capital actually determines where future capital will grow. If you look at the number of Canadians that are operating in Silicon Valley because they could not raise capital and build businesses in Canada, and this is particularly true for British Columbians, it's astounding. The problem is once those people leave, with the Canadian values and the Canadian ethos of giving back, when they leave, it is very hard for them to come back. They start new companies when they see an exit like Instagram. They actually create new companies. They invest where they already are and where they know talent. And so the question I think we have to ask ourselves is, what does it take for us to make it possible for people to innovate and to create the types of jobs that we want, so we're not just talking about a living wage, but a wage that enables people to do more than just live, but to thrive? To me, that's a very, very important piece of what the tech world can do. So what do we need? Number one, we need government to stop being allergic to the notion of risk. This is a problem that happens on the left, and is a problem that happens on the right. Everyone says government cannot take risk when it comes to how do we enable and empower entrepreneurs and aspirational innovators. So that could be things like what is happening in Korea, Hong Kong, Sweden, Queensland, India, Ontario, Finland, Japan, Germany, Israel, or in the US, which is the notion of startup funds that help companies build and grow. That means potentially capital, it means potentially spaces, especially in a place like British Columbia where the cost of space is at a premium. We have lots of space that government owns. How do we start thinking about government as a partner with the private sector in helping to create innovation? Number two, are we providing the education that is required for young people to be able to come out and thrive in those sectors? Number three, are we actually encouraging people to think about becoming conscientious contributors when they build these businesses? And if so, how? What incentives from a tax perspective, from an education perspective, from a community engagement perspective, are we giving entrepreneurs so that they feel like they want to be here, so that they feel like they belong to this community? These are questions that I think we have to ask from the tech perspective, because in 2030, if you want this green economy that Mr. Broadbent so eloquently discussed as being a source of as an economic engine, then you have to create that environment where people can succeed here. So I think we have to move away from thinking that we are this amazing place and we're just not getting ourselves going, to realizing that the capital flow isn't necessarily here. And it's not because people don't want to invest. They do. But we have to ask ourselves how government coming up in the next few years can create the environment where it makes sense, not just because we want to create jobs and we want to create new companies, but because that will drive a sense and a spirit of innovation that will start to democratize, I think, the way in which people can work together, the way in which technology can enable. So I would put that out there as something that from the tech perspective, we really need to be thinking about, because funding for innovation cannot just be R&D money. Funding for innovation has to be supporting companies across the sector that are aspirational, that are starting, so that that young Syrian refugee who learns how to code through a co-op can then raise the capital to be able to create new jobs. And to me, that's how I think you bring those pieces together.
Thank you for a very thoughtful and excitingly expressed perspective. Ross, I'll move on to you now.
Thank you, Janet. This is going to be a bit of a rant. Thank you. This is a rant about growth, because really I think we have to move off of our growth model. Growth, it's been the dominant economic model of our lifetime, everybody in this room. It's created the society we have now, and what's wrong with that? We live healthier, longer lives. We have more junk, better living conditions, generally speaking. The problem is this model is just not sustainable. And I mean sustainable in the real sense. Sustainable is a word that is synonymous with permanence, eternal, forever. It's a very misused word. Our society today has been achieved at the expense of our soil and water, rapid depletion of non-renewable resources like energy and minerals, destruction of much of the Earth's land base, potentially catastrophic declines in biodiversity, the very underpinning of human life, and potentially existential threats to human life in terms of changes to atmospheric CO2 and ocean acidity. Our global economy today is 5 times that it was in 1950, 5 times. If we grow at current rates, by 2050, assuming everybody in the world has today's level of affluence of an average Canadian, the world economy has to be 15 times bigger than it is today. 15 times. Well, of course, this isn't possible. We simply don't have the resource base to achieve this. So change is inevitable. And our choice is whether this change happens by design or by disaster. One solution is to have governments recognize that juicing economies with more and more debt isn't working anymore and unfairly burdens future generations. Stop the blind obsession with GDP growth and focus more on quality, not quantity, on better, not bigger. And there are many ways to do this, and hundreds of thousands of British Columbians, I would say virtually everyone in this room, is already working every day in their own way to build a more sustainable economy. They're pushing change from the bottom up, but it would sure help if our provincial government got on side more, in fact, all levels of government. So some successes today that I think are good models. Well, quite frankly, I think what we are doing in Vancouver is pretty good. I see a lot that's going right, driven by a very enlightened mayor and council. I see how my children are living and their friends, what their transportation preferences are, and how they look at consumption, for example. On the other hand, I see a lot of places in BC that don't get it and aren't making the necessary changes. They'd be better off looking at successful examples of more beautiful, less stressful, more human towns and cities that exist all over Europe, for example. Places where walking and biking are preferred over cars. For example, in nearly every single town in Europe, there are car-free streets, where there are better farming practices, longer-lasting infrastructure, less urban sprawl, less waste, and better building design, just to name a few. One amazing change happening today is in renewable energy. Really, we are living in an energy revolution as profound as the change from wood to coal in the 1800s or from coal to oil. The big difference this time is that it is using truly sustainable energy sources. I'm in the middle of this with my energy company, Alterra Power. We produce electricity from wind, solar, hydro, and geothermal sources. And we're now producing enough to power a city about the size of Vancouver. It's really incredible what innovations and cost reductions I've seen in just the last 6 years in power generation, transmission, storage, and end use. So there's a lot to be optimistic about. Going to a 100% renewable energy economy is absolutely possible by 2050 and maybe even by 2030. In my future, we will use fewer non-renewable resources like minerals and fossil fuels. But don't point your finger at mining companies. All they're doing is responding to demand, and that is set by humans. Less demand, fewer mines. Yes, this will hurt some parts of our economy, but there will be offsets elsewhere, such as a bigger recycling industry and a more dynamic circular economy. We need to change our direction and change it quickly. The result might be less choice, less speed, less stimulation, and less stuff. But it will result in a more healthy, more happy, and more prosperous people and province. Prosperous in the biggest sense, and truly sustainable for the long-term benefit of my children and their children and so on. So that's my vision for 2030, and it's achievable.
I think you've kept, you certainly hit a nerve with the group, so I thank you very much for that perspective. Iglika, can you share your thoughts with us now?
Thank you very much for inviting me to be on this panel, and to all of you for coming. Really, like all of you, I'm here today because I know we can do better, and I know that we can build a province that works for all of us, that works for everyone, no matter if we're young and old or old, no matter what we look like, how we dress, who we love, where our parents come from, or how much money we have in our wallet today. And the kind of economy that Mr. Broadbent spoke about earlier, and we all talk about here, which empowers everyone to participate and brings broader perspectives together, is frankly not the kind of economy we have today. And we've never really had an economy that worked for everyone. So it isn't just about making BC great again, because it's about building a different province, right? Yeah. And so what I'm interested in is what are the kind of things that we might need to change in the way we're doing business or in the way we're thinking about the economy today that will make this possible, that will make this new economy possible. And I think one of the fundamental things that we do need to change is how we think of the economy, and some of the previous speakers have alluded to that. But traditional economic wisdom has been that our primary focus is the growing of the proverbial economic pie. And whether it's just measured by GDP growth or whether it's measured by something else like innovation or how many companies we create or how many jobs we create, we need to be creating more rather than worrying about the distribution. So traditional wisdom is that it's more important to get the economy working than to ask who is it working for. And I think this way of looking at things sees social programs as luxuries we can afford only after we have achieved this desirable level of economic growth or innovation, but not before. Only after we have wealth, we can think about maybe becoming conscientious contributors if we feel like it, if we have the right incentives. But I think this is backwards. I think the social infrastructure shouldn't be seen as an afterthought. It is the foundation on which our economy is built. It is impossible to build an inclusive economy without having a more equitable distribution of resources and power. The kind of concentration we're seeing of power and wealth is undermining our ability to bring the broader perspectives together and to all have a seat at the table. And I think this is the first thing we need to address. Because poverty and social exclusion are destroying human potential and undermining the economy, not just in faraway countries and faraway places, but right here at home. I invite you to take a stroll around this neighborhood and see the contrast in this wealthy, beautiful city that people envy, and see the kind of abject poverty that's 5 minutes down the street. So the research is clear. A healthy society is a more productive society. A more equal society is one that is healthier and better educated. And so we do need the talents, creativity, and experience of all British Columbians and of all people, really, to build the kind of province we are all talking about today and that we all want to live in. And one of the biggest opportunities I see today that we haven't talked about, except maybe Prem a little bit, is the opportunity to tap into the potential of recent immigrants, of indigenous people, of women with young children and no childcare options, and other groups who currently face big barriers to their full participation in our economy and in our society. And to expand access to the job market and to expand access to empowerment to this group, we need public investment in the $10 a day childcare plan. It can't just be employers who see this as a priority and do it themselves. It can't just be charity. It needs to be universal access. We also need universal access to paid sick leave and paid family leave, which we don't have in Canada, except in one province where there is, I think it's PEI, and it is 1 day of paid sick leave is mandatory, statutory requirement. And here in BC, we don't have it. We need diversity pay equity strategies because we don't have pay equity, and technology is a great sector and it's awesome. My partner works in it. It's a great sector for young men. It's not that great for young women. They do leave it very quickly after they enter it, and we need to ask why. We need also tuition-free high school upgrading courses for adults who, for whatever reason, haven't been able to get the education they need when they are going to high school. And we need ESL courses for immigrants, and just last year our government made those things that used to be tuition-free start charging tuition. And that's a huge barrier to bringing the broader perspectives we all need together. So I think what this means is that we can no longer separate economic policy from social policy, right? I think yesterday, for those of you who heard V's mom's story, childcare policy is economic policy. It is empowerment. That's what we need. And the same goes with, the paid sick leave and the other protections. And the truth is, in order to succeed, we need to change the rules of the game. So we need to offset this rising concentration of wealth and power in the hands of the few. And the way we do this is we have to shift the balance of power between workers and employers in a big way. We need to empower workers. We need to strengthen their voices. That includes cooperative decision-making model, more collaborative decision-making models, and businesses are adopting those, even if they don't formally call themselves co-ops. But we also need policy changes. We need to make it easier for workers to come together, to unionize, to proactively enforce labor standards, and we need higher penalties for employers who are breaking the rules. Because we don't have inspections here in BC to see how many employers are breaking the rules, but in Ontario, they did blitz inspections just last year on employers who tend to employ precarious workers, like security firms and gyms and retail and fast food. And they found that 78% of the employers they checked were breaking one rule or another, but there's just nothing to do about it. You couldn't enforce it. So we do need harsher penalties and more enforcement. And we need minimum wages that are living, that are allowing people to not be working poor, and then we can move on to thriving. I do agree that's a better goal, but we're not quite there yet. So these are some of the changes I think about, and I think we need to consider if we really want to build a dynamic and a resilient economy that meaningfully includes all of us.
Thank you very much, Iglika, and to all of our panelists. So we now have time for some questions, and I'm going to start with a couple of questions for the panel as a whole. So my first one is what are the hard choices that the people of BC need to make in order to make the kinds of changes we need to build a better vision for BC? So who would like to start?
I guess everybody's
Prem,
looking at me.
Go
Okay.
for it. Yeah.
Sure, I can start. I mean, I think it's always a lot of points that Taleeb made were resonating with me as well, because we cross over into the tech sector a lot. Technology has transformed the creative industries. The Pacific Press building in Surrey is now a studio for a large Hollywood production company because the paper doesn't get printed there anymore. Great use of that space and employing a lot of people. But I think it's, sort of going back to my earlier point, it is that balance of how do we encourage that development of these high-skilled tech jobs, people that work in the film industry, but at the same time, what is that climate needed through investment or through getting people to stay here Everything that you were saying is something that I almost think about every single day, is how do we continue to foster that development here and encourage those people to stay here? Because I think the people and the talent are our biggest asset and our biggest risk as well. Because if people start leaving and the climate here doesn't allow them to stay here and flourish, and here in BC, even in Canada for that matter, that's going to be difficult and will really stagnate what we're already starting to build here.
Tamara, looks like you have a thought.
Yeah, and just building on Prem's point there, I think to your direct question, what's the greatest trade-off or shift in the way that we think? I think probably the most challenging one is going to be from short-term challenges and benefits to longer-term. And a lot of what we've been talking about here, I think a common theme, is the fact that what we really need is an investment in kind of modern and inclusive infrastructure. And normally we think of infrastructure as roads and buildings and bridges and tunnels. But really what we're talking about is a different kind of infrastructure. Education, social programs that increase the likelihood of equal economic participation. Technology infrastructure. I mean, when you think about it, the infrastructure that we have, that we drive our cars on, the roads, largely speaking, are publicly provided. Increasingly, the road that we're all going to be driving on is going to be a digital one. That is still a privately held, privately paid, and controlled set of infrastructure. How can we possibly generate the kind of economy that these folks are talking about without collectively understanding those kinds of investments? And I think those are some really big challenges that we need to be talking about in terms of how do we attract capital for the kinds of infrastructure investment that we're going to need going forward. These are big shifts in what we're talking about.
Huge shifts. Ross, I suspect you have a perspective on some of the hard choices we need to make, and then I'll move to you, Taleeb.
Well, there's I mean, on one absurd endpoint, a perfectly sustainable society, it's the Y solution. We do yoga, we live in yurts, and we eat yogurt. And that makes us all very happy. And it consumes nothing, almost nothing. No, but I mean, really, I think that my solution is just to slow down a little bit. Just slow down. You don't need infrastructure if you don't need cars. You don't need infrastructure if you aren't going from A to B to C to D all the time. Remember nature, Eco is the first part of economy. Eco means nature. I mean, eco means the ecosystem. And if we kill that, there's going to be no economy. Social justice, forget it. If we don't have a sustainable economy that lives in sync with our environment, social justice is actually irrelevant. If our society collapses because we destroy our natural capital, that's it. So let's get our priorities right. And I think one solution to get us more sustainability in our system is to slow down, use less junk, get outside a bit more, and that's what I try to do.
Great. Taleeb?
Just a couple of things. One is I'd like to start by respectfully disagreeing with you, Ross. I think one of the challenges is that if people are trying to figure out where their next meal is going to come from, or where their next how they're going to make sure their kids have what they need, it's pretty tough to take the time out to slow down when you're trying to figure out how you're going to make ends meet first. I think we have to create the environment where people are able to meet their basic needs in a substantial way, move from the living wage to a wage that enables them to thrive. And then I think all of these pieces start to come. I don't disagree that that's a good outcome, but I think that we have a long way to go in terms of being able to support that.
And I couldn't agree more with that.
To your question, I think the choice that British Columbians, I think Canadians, and all of us have to make is, are we prepared to force the people that we elect to think about the consequences of decisions, not just election cycle to election cycle? And I think often the answer is we'd like that, but we don't really demand that. And so if you want economic change for 2030, 2040, 2050, and you want the type of economy that we all seem to be talking about, then I think we as citizens, it's incumbent on us to stop expecting election to election outcomes and longer term outcomes, and actually telling politicians, our expectation is for you to think about what this is going to look like when all of us are dead and gone, and not just about what happens at the ballot box in 4 years or 5 years. But that's a mindset shift that I think is incumbent on politicians to actually help enable as well. And that's the choice we have to make. We can either stay in the cycle, or we can say, you know what, we have bigger fish to fry that are much longer term than our own sort of short-term objective.
Yeah, let me press you on that a little further. How do we encourage our politicians to actually take that longer-term perspective? It's a huge challenge for them. It's a huge challenge. What?
Yes, absolutely. And I know that there are a bunch of them. So first, I think, I would say there are briefly three things. One is we need to start being more aware of the issues and asking, and we in this room is one thing, but I think we as a people need to start asking questions that are much tougher and not accept sometimes the crappy answers that we get from all sides of the spectrum, number one. Number two is to stop setting the bar so low for politicians, right? And I've said this in other contexts, and I'll say this here. In tech, in law, in medicine, when you go to your doctor, you don't say, don't kill me. You say, make me better. Politicians, the expectation is, don't screw up and we'll reelect you. The bar is so low that if they trip over the bar, but they make it over, we're excited. And I'm sorry to say this because I know there's a lot of good people in public life. Yeah. But we have to say, we expect this. We're not expecting you to be perfect. We do expect meaningful, substantial things where you take the perspective that is longer term. I think we have to set the expectation. And the third, I think, is to be clear that we cannot win on all fronts all the time. And to say we are going to agree that some things that some people want will not happen, some things that other people want will not happen. If everybody is generally unhappy, we've probably done something right. But to be able to accept the conversation that contemplates the idea that not everything will be achieved immediately. So this sense of immediate need for gratification that we have with Twitter and Instagram and social media needs to exit the notion of the broader public good, and to say what's coming up is more important. I think those are three things that we as citizens can start to do. But it's tough, right? It's very tough, but I think we have to start doing that. We can't expect politicians to do everything on their own.
Corporate world too.
Yeah,
Same thing.
absolutely.
Same thing. I mean, quarter to quarter. It's not exactly a recipe for long-term thinking.
Yeah, absolutely. Iglika, your thoughts on what are the hard choices?
Oh, I agree with much of what has been said. I think that being able to switch from the short-term vision to the longer-term perspective is a key one. I also agree with the need to rebalance our economy and think about what we invest in, which Taleeb mentioned around how difficult it is to get capital for tech or it really for any small business, because the way the system is set up, it really prioritizes some companies over others. It's easier if you're a big company. Then, we see in the financial crisis we saw in the US and not just there, companies that are too big to fail, and it's very easy to get credit at very low rates, but if you're small or new, good luck to you. So I think we need to rebalance that, but we also need to think about, besides government taking more risk and investing, what UK economist Mariana Mazzucato talks about is we need to also socialize some of the profits of that investment once it pays off. Because a lot of the risks don't pay off, but the ones that do, we have currently a system in which we do invest in R&D, we do invest in public universities, we do invest in structures that empower at least some people to take these risks. But if they win for themselves. We really have privatized the benefits, and we cut taxes. We have reduced both corporate and personal to the extent that the people who have made it have the option to contribute via charity, but that's all, right? Like we don't have a system of socializing the benefit in that way, and I think that's the next barrier that we need to think about, and how do we take more of the return on that investment that we make as a public.
So I find the discussion about political culture really interesting, and obviously a very important one for the group in this room. So this is a very knowledgeable group, but one of the things that strikes me is that we have a very low level, and I'm sorry to say it, but a low level of political and economic literacy in our country generally. And I've thought a lot about how do we actually shift that? What are the realistic ways of doing it? My own personal conclusion is that the best thing we could do is to start to reintroduce in our school system more discussion or more focus on basic political and economic literacy around what used to be called civics. So that would be my view, but I'm wondering what the panelists think of this and whether they see other ways that we can actually work to develop a more sophisticated political and economic culture generally. Is that unanswerable? Prem, it looks like you have a thought.
And I don't know if I'm really answering this question, but when we look at Canadian content as an example, these are, the industry has developed through policies, both provincially and federally, around Canadian content creation, the development of Canadian companies, which fostered investment in Canadian talent development, and we know this talent goes around the world. So it is that I don't know if enough, to your point, if there is the federal government just had this online survey where 10,000 Canadians participated in. That's a good number. Would have been great if it was 200,000 people who actually had an interest in what is the future of the CBC, Telefilm Canada, the National Film Board. I feel like we sometimes end up in our silos of whatever your industry is or your sector is, and that's where the people who work in those sectors, you develop an in-depth knowledge, obviously for business reasons, but how that gets integrated into an education system in grade 4, from when I remember first starting to learn things about the Canadian political systems and what kind of impact a regular citizen can have. We're living in a pretty jaded world right now, and I think we're seeing that with the U.S. election. It becomes very difficult, I think, in my personal opinion, in encouraging people to want to be part of it. And I think that's just, we have to be realistic about that.
It is quite, it's absolutely stunning to me to hear, some of the comments from the United States where people just have no expectation. I think Donald Trump's truth rating is something like 5% of all of his statements, and yet people don't expect it. So I agree with you, Taleeb, that we do need to have higher expectations for our politicians. And I think you had your hand up.
Yeah, on this issue of how do you get people to be more literate when it comes to public policy and politics, people. I look at, I love this city dearly, and I look at what has happened over the last year, and we get excised over traffic because there are bike lanes, but we voted against more funding for transit. So I sometimes think that, we look down at the Americans and we say, look, they always vote against their own interests. We do a great job of that too sometimes.
Yes, yeah, we do.
And so I think if you ask people, if we start to talk to, or if people, and probably should say we, I think if politicians, if all of us talk to each other from a basis of curiosity and actual interest in what people have to say, I think that level of education starts to occur almost organically, where these co-ops that Tamara spoke eloquently about, where community groups, where organizations start to cultivate and nurture dialogue, not just in their silos, but across. But we own some of that, right? I think we as citizens and as organizations and as corporations own some of that. And it's, I think, much easier for us at a variety of different levels in the age spectrum, whether you're 19, 29, 59, or 99, to have a conversation with people and to agree to disagree about things if that conversation is around something meaningful. But we don't have spaces where those types of conversations occur. Yeah. We don't create, the online world, I think, does sometimes a good job of this, and then people get mad at each other and they switch off. But this is a perfect example of how you actually can create those environments. But it can't be imposed from on high, but you also can't expect it to happen organically if you don't create the spaces for it. So I think that's how you actually get to literacy, by enablement rather than by imposition.
I've always said that we need to take these conversations where they're hard. We're always comfortable talking to people who share our views, but it's so much more important to make that effort to reach out across the boundaries that divide people in society and the economy, and make a sincere effort to listen to those whose views are different. And I think, Vancity is certainly a great example of an organization that provides provides that kind of neutral convening space. I think the YWCA does as well, and certainly in the work that we do at the Y, the work that Tamara and I have both done with the Vancouver Board of Trade and also in the social economy are examples of that. But yes, I would agree with you. We need to take that much more broadly. Any other final comments on political culture and how we shift it? Iglika.
Okay. Just on that note of having spaces, I want to go back to the idea that, again, Taleeb brought up earlier, that if you're running around having 3 jobs trying to feed your children and wondering if you're going to get evicted tomorrow, you're not going to come to the spaces, even if they're in your neighborhood. And so I do think that we need to sort out some fundamental issues here and deal with the extreme cases of poverty and inequality before we can come together in those spaces, before all of us can come together. And just wanted to give a shout out to broadband for providing childcare or offering childcare for this event, because this is another barrier that makes a lot of young women and men these days not able to come to events like that and have their voices heard, is because we don't have childcare.
Okay. I'm going to move to another question. I think a number of you have referenced the fundamental importance of education in terms of building the innovation economy. So, and also you've talked about how important it is to have a steady supply of skilled and educated talent. So what is the best way for BC to achieve that? What are the most important investments we can make in education and why? Somebody want to take that one?
So why don't we talk about coding?
Yeah.
I think that is a very interesting investment, and certainly we, right now in the visual effects and animation industries, I think we approximately have a couple of hundred job vacancies, and jobs that big companies like Sony ImageWorks and Canadian companies like DHX are trying to fill. I always think about, one of my jobs is actually encouraging people to enter these industries and even consider using their education towards, whether you're in computer science or engineering or going to the Vancouver Film School, where those skills are transferable, and it may not have been what you originally thought. So I think that there's actually a lot happening in the education system. I always think about how do we get those people actually interested in entering the sectors that I'm responsible for, and that's not as easy as you think, but it is also ensuring that people understand that these are long-term jobs. It's a very enticing industry because you're working on, something like the My Little Pony movie to the Angry Birds, which are, have a lot of credibility when it comes to your own professional and career development. So I sort of think about, we're encouraging more, especially on the technical side, skills development, but ensuring that people know that there's a variety of ways that you can use those skills, from working in the video game industry to going to work at Slack to help them further develop their technology.
Thank you. Tamara, you had a perspective?
Yeah, a little bit, as I referenced earlier. I think that while there's definitely a need to make sure that we are providing opportunities for skill building in areas of acute shortage and need, as Prem talked about. I think the place where, because those skills seem to change so quickly, if we were in this room 20 years ago, we would have been talking about quite a different group of skills, and I anticipate 5 years from now it could be different yet again. So I think the real challenge is how we educate, and for whom, and in what way. And a lot of what we talked about in terms of getting people engaged and confident and participating is about how we access education opportunities. So I think it's not, in the case of education, personally, I think it's less a question of what and more a question of how and for whom that we need to think about.
Thank you. Taleeb, did you have your mic on there?
Sure, yeah. If you look at the opportunities that people have and how the education system is succeeding or failing. Look, I think the question of investment is important. I mean, you should be investing in education, period. And I think how you invest in education comes in a variety of different ways. But, there's also not this never-ending pit of money. I think everybody understands that, but education, of course, is going to give you your highest ROI. So what does that mean? I think that means classrooms that look more and more like this century rather than the last one is important. Tools that teachers need, smaller classroom sizes, all of the things that everybody talks about as being important. But then where do you take that? What is the rest of our responsibility? I mean, how does the private sector create opportunity for young people who want to do internships, who want to come and do a co-op program in not just coding, but in product marketing, in digital marketing, in strategy, in engineering, in infrastructure, and business development? How do you expose young people to those opportunities, not just when they're in high school, but when they're in university? And how do universities and colleges in British Columbia actually start to think about what is not just marketable, but what is long-term? And I don't want to overuse the word sustainable, but what kind of skill set are they delivering that is not just a pure technical skill set, but a broader set of competencies that enable that skill set to evolve? And I don't think we do a particularly good job of that. I think we're so either very esoteric and philosophical, or we are very, very linear in what we deliver. But I think sometimes education needs to be, I think what the U.S. has done in terms of how liberal arts colleges actually enable people to go into the tech world and be very successful, is to be able to bring those pieces together. And that takes, I think, support from the private sector. It takes the ability for universities and colleges to have better funding and sustainable sources of funding. But I think it also requires that then we are able to point towards longer term outcomes.
Yep.
But I think that's where the investment needs to be a little bit more than perhaps where it is today.
When we talk about education, it's very easy for us to think about K-12 and post-secondary, and that's where most people go, and sometimes forget the fundamental importance of the early learning. And certainly there's considerable economic analysis done that demonstrates that investment in high-quality early learning will actually have the most profound impact on the future human capital development and actually developing the skills for the creative economy. So that's a bit of a push to you, to Iglika. I'm sure you have a comment on that.
Oh, absolutely, and I agree with the points that it's less important what the skills are that we're building or teaching or the content, but rather how do we build confident, empowered citizens who are going to participate in our democracy. And I think one of the problems that we need to face is the fact that these days we do see this push, and it does come from the private sector a lot of the time, that we need education to be kind of a direct pathway to a job, that we need our public institutions to prepare people who fit the particular gap that exists in the job market today. And that's a rather short-term view that we need to escape, I think. In order to see this real change, we need to educate people to be citizens and to participate, to be innovative and confident, and not to fit a particular job market need that could be here today but not here tomorrow. I think the flexibility, and that's why I'm encouraged to hear the call for liberal arts education, because but it's exactly the opposite of what we're seeing from our government at the moment. We're seeing a complete lack of investment and cuts to humanities and what would count as liberal arts, and everything's going into very directly, practically applied business or STEM fields, and that's a big problem.
Okay, thank you. It's now your turn. I'm be very pleased to open the floor to questions, and so I think we have Alejandro, who will help me direct questions. Who would like to go first?
Okay, so please put up your hand. What I'm suggesting we do is that we take 3 questions, and then we go to the panel for the second round. If you have comments, save them for the second round, if that's okay. So put up your hand if you have a question really high, and I'll try to be equitable in terms of taking 3. 1, 2, over here. 3, anyone else? Okay, we'll take 4. 4 questions, be generous. Make them brief, please, so that we only have about 10 minutes for this section, and we want to be able to have a very quick word from the panel in response. A reminder to everyone to please speak very closely to the microphone. We cannot raise the volume at your desk or at any of the desks, so speak closely and speak loudly. Why don't we go over here? Thank you.
My name is Diana Smith, and I'd be interested in your perspective on both the current role of the media and what shifts need to occur in terms of media as an agent of social change and public discourse.
Great, let's go. We're going to take them all as a group, and go ahead, sir.
David Black, I'm president of Move Up. My question about looking forward and transitioning our economy is, what I didn't hear is how we're going to transition workers who are invested in the current economy. As Democratic spokespeople for working people, what many working people see when they hear these changes is threats to their own income security. And we hear about incentives to get business to change, and those can be quite successful, and business can be quite quick to adapt to those things. But working people are often left behind. We hear this term just transition for workers. That really means going from a mature collective agreement with family supporting wages to something barely above minimum wage, or a brand new collective agreement without all those benefits. So working people are naturally reluctant to embrace these changes that we're all saying are necessary. How do we deal with that directly?
Thanks. Please, go ahead.
I liked what Taleeb had to say about governments getting more comfortable with risk, and Iglika also mentioned that if you're small and you're new, then good luck to you in terms of getting loans. So I would like to hear from Tamara specifically about what Vancity and other financial cooperatives can do to get more comfortable with risk and to lend to smaller businesses like mine that are pretty much left to our own devices.
Okay.
Okay, one more question before we go to the panel, and then when the panel answers, don't feel the need to answer every question, and not everyone has to speak, so that we can hear from as many people as possible in the room. Go ahead.
Thank you. And Taleeb, the bar is pretty low, and that's good for me today. Ross, you're welcome to move to my constituency in Port Renfrew. We have yurts, we have yoga, we have yogurt, and we don't have any broadband, so you can leave your junk at home. Tamara, I would have loved to have heard you talk a little bit about co-op housing, if you can get that in 20 seconds. But what I would really like to focus on is the great equalizer, that's public education. And Iglika was the only panelist that spoke directly about childcare and early childhood education. I would wonder if the other panelists had something to say about that. For me, 2030 is going to be all about making sure everyone's participating in the workforce, and that our children are where they're safe, where they can learn, and where they can participate in socialization as well as education. So there you go.
So that's 4 questions in a very brief period of time. So I'm just going to ask the panelists. Perhaps we could have one panelist speak to each of the questions. So who would like to take the role of media? All right, Prem.
So as someone who supports the development of media, those questions or the role of what local media means has changed so much because of technology. So we now have, I believe that a blog or a website like Vancity Buzz is actually more read than the Vancouver Sun. So it's actually paying more attention to all these other sources, that most of us are going to our Facebook feed to actually learn about what's going on both in our communities, and that can also become a very narrow view because most of your friends share your perspectives. So it's actually, I feel, the responsibility of all of us as media organizations become smaller. And I was at an event the other day, the 2 local daily newspapers had the same reporters for both of those papers and their digital assets and whatever else, and that's just the reality of economics as well, but also that we're consuming information in a very different way. So I think we have to embrace the shift. We have the opportunity to be more participatory in it, but also, with what the federal government and the CRTC are looking at right now, and all of these policies are on the table, we're told, is where does that, again, coming back to that economic investment, come in? What is the public's role or the government's role in continuing to support a diversity of voices within that?
Thank you. So, Tamara, there were 2 questions directed to you specifically. One is about risk and how we can create an environment which is a little bit more open to risk-taking, and the other was about cooperative housing. So I'm going to ask you to answer both together, if you don't mind.
We don't really relate, but that's
I know. We only have a few minutes, so yeah. I thought I would, combine.
So on the issue of access to credit and loans, it is a long-standing truth in banking and finance that people with the most money get more money. And so, and often at a far reduced rate, frankly, on a percentage dollar basis. So one of the things that I think cooperative finance and broader-based community finance can really facilitate is the fact that we're able to look at risk in a broader way. So when we're able to look at the networks that support a small business, understand the supply chain that supports a small business, understand the motivation of the small business, put the small business in contact with resources that can help them with business plans, legal, accounting, all the nuts and bolts that make a successful business, we know that that reduces our risk. And in fact, it's not a greater risk to lend than others. And I think that is something that's beginning to be understood by larger financial institutions as well. You see them experimenting with ideas like crowdfunding, alternative credit adjudication, where who's in your network counts as much as your credit score. Certainly there's been a lot of innovation there. So we lend to more small businesses than any other financial institution in Western Canada, and we're definitely not the largest financial institution. So I think we like small businesses, and I think the reason is we understand that they're not riskier. In fact, because of the fact they're connected to the local economy, they can actually be less risk. But I would encourage us to think about how we support smaller businesses and startups in terms of our own purchasing decisions, in terms of our own support. That often reduces risk as well. On the co-op housing side, the cooperative housing is a model that was in place for a very long time, and then it sort of withered a bit, atrophied because of a lack of support, and it's experiencing a renaissance. I think one of the challenges for co-op housing has been that financial institutions have not been very good at financing it. Frankly, it's hard to get a mortgage if you are in a housing co-op. So except for from a credit union. So understanding that model and how we establish housing models for modern living, closer to transit, with more family space and so on, is part of the opportunity, definitely on the co-op housing front.
Okay, thank you. The question about transitioning workers in the current economy, I think that's a really tough question, and I'm going to ask Ross to address that.
It is a tough question, David. It's a very thorny one. You can't stop change. You can't always live in the past. Otherwise we'd all have horse and buggies and a lot of really good horse and buggy drivers. But the solution there is to get a driver's license, and so you just it's a real tough one, especially with where technology is going. I mean, there's a lot more robotics. There's more artificial intelligence. There's a lot more devices that take away jobs, and so it's a very, very big problem, particularly for, you could say, less skilled people who don't have the kind of capacity or the opportunity to change. And I guess there's not real easy solutions. My own kind of, maybe it's a bit of an idealistic view, maybe not, but a view of the future is that we actually have a smaller economy, and we have, we actually work less. We have more time for leisure. We don't necessarily need more money, and we spend things on non-financial things. So it's all part of where I think we absolutely have to go. I mean, growth in any finite system always, 100% always leads to collapse, always. So we have to change the direction we're going. We absolutely have to, or it'll be forced on us. So there are going to be huge transitional problems, and this is, I would say this is absolutely one of the biggest ones. What do we do with the workforce? How do we deal with this huge labor population we have that needs jobs to be satisfied, needs jobs to be create a great family environment. I mean, just all the good things that come with labor. But I think some of those problems are solved with working less and trying to need money less. I mean, is it idealistic? Maybe. Is it achievable? Yes, I think it is. But it has to be a different paradigm than we are all thinking about today, particularly our government, particularly our corporate world, particularly our banking world, where it's growth, 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 growth. Bigger is better. Always get larger. Always strive for growing, growing, growing. It's just not possible. It's going to end in a bust. So let's start making the move now.
Thanks, Ross. So we just have a couple of minutes, and I think, John, you also had a question about public education. So I will ask the panelists, anyone who wants to comment, your thoughts on public education. Iglika.
Well, nobody else picked up on the early childcare, so I'll mention it again. I do think it is very important. Thank you. And it's important for two reasons. Why? We already have a public education system. We understand that it benefits us all to educate other people's children, right? And with all the last 20 years of research on brain development, we know that education doesn't start at age 6. It starts much earlier. And we need to set the foundation. And it just, all the research, looking at all the research makes me think, why aren't we expanding early childhood education? It's a natural part of the public education system, just going to the early ages. And it will benefit children. It also will benefit the moms. If you were there last night to hear V's story of her refugee mom who couldn't get a real job because there's nobody to mind the children. She couldn't get childcare, and that's why she couldn't get into English classes and assimilate in the economy. And it's just a huge problem for so many women, and it's still mostly women, that I really think it needs to be addressed. I only want to, very, very briefly talk about the just transition things, because I do think it's very important and it is difficult, but we maybe need to rethink social protections, because our system of social protections, from things like paid sick leave to health benefits and access to, subsidized drugs and going to the dentist, comes from your employer. And if we don't have the same structure of full-time employees, and I'm going to be with the same employer for 20 years, then how do we provide those benefits to people so that they can innovate? But all my young friends who are starting to have kids now don't want to start their own startup because they need to take the kid to the dentist. And that's the kind of things we need.
Okay. Well, most unfortunately, this brings us to the conclusion of our time together. I think I could talk to you guys all morning, and there's so many dimensions to this topic that would be really interesting to explore, but unfortunately, we just don't have the time. So I'll ask you all to give a very warm round of applause to Tamara and our panelists. And I think we now have a break. Is that right, Alejandro?
I'm just going to make a quick announcement to say, first of all, thank you to Janet, Tamara, Taleeb, Prem, and Iglika, which you've already done, which is great. And as we head into our session focused on developing a collective vision for the future BC we want, just want to pull out a couple of the things that we heard this morning for you to keep in mind during the break and to talk to each other about the agreement on innovation and the democratic and diverse decision-making that's desirable and exemplified by the cooperative movement, the need to leverage assets that already exist in the province with government, creating the enabling conditions for innovation and for infrastructure investments, and growth that's inclusive, challenging the prevailing growth model with one that privileges sustainability with equity at the core, where economic policy goes hand in hand with social policy and workers' rights, and governments are making decisions in the long term. So think about these things. At 11 a.m., we're going to come back and we're going to go through a dynamic session imagining the BC we want to build. Thanks.